You have one precious life. How will you make your money work for you? It's time for Sage Money Conversations, where your financial happiness and confidence are always the subject. Here's your host, certified financial planner, Barbara Norman.
Well, welcome to Sage Money Conversations. Today, I am delighted to have Amanda Singer with us. Amanda is a family law attorney. She is with the West Coast Financial Mediation Center, and she's going to talk to us today a lot about mediation, what that means, blended families, and a conversation that's near and dear to my heart, and that's prenups and why they're so important. So, Amanda, welcome to the show. Thank you for taking time and being on with us.
Thank you, Barbara. So happy to be here.
So tell us a little bit about mediation. And I love this concept. So talk to me about mediation and why that's so important today.
Yeah, certainly. So if you don't mind, I think what I'll start with is a little bit about what mediation is, because I think that some people they might have heard the word or they may have seen it. What comes to mind a lot of times, people always say, oh, like wedding crashers, right? So, that's what I get still these days. But, so mediation, as a mediator, I work as a neutral third party. And so what that means is I don't represent either of the parties I work with, but I'm working with both of them. For me, in my case, most of that is family mediation cases, so divorce or the other kind of things you mentioned as well. And so I work with the couple or with the families to work through all of the different issues. And the thing with mediation is a lot of benefits surrounding it. And the idea that, first and foremost, it's a collaborative process. It's working together amicably. And it's working together amicably in most of the time in the midst of conflict. Right. So it's the idea that, you've got conflict going on, whatever that dispute is or whatever the issue is, and you're trying to work together with the other person. In my case, most of the time that may be their spouse or their ex-spouse or their co-parent, to reach an agreement together. And so it's just so important because it allows the parties to come together and reach the agreements that they want. Mediation is a voluntary process, so it is something that both people or all parties, if there's more than two, have to be willing to participate in. But it's a way to resolve disputes outside of court. And so, especially in the case of divorce or co-parenting issues, they often have a court case that's associated with it. And you often can end up litigating and in front of a judge dealing with those issues. And so mediation allows the parties instead to say, we want to do this outside of court. We want to reach agreements jointly, and then we want to file those agreements on our own.
Yeah, I could see why that would be so important. Like I started laughing, thinking, how do you take something that's so emotional? It's one of the biggest financial transactions in your life and act amicably. But when you talk about it this way, it's like, I would not want a judge who doesn't know me, my children, or anybody making that decision. So, coming to the table is huge. And so when you've got someone who's high conflict, like how do you bring them together?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is kind of talk about interest-based negotiation or interest-focused mediation. And what I mean by that is the idea that we focus on interests, right? So what is it that each person wants or what are their interests? And it's not just the position. So a lot of times when people, and we do this in our own life, right, personally as well, when you think about like a dispute, you think about like, this is my position, right? I want this. And you don't always think about, well, why or what are your interests around it? And when you do position based, you're almost always going to be opposite of the other person, right? Because you want one thing that either the other person wants that same exact thing and there's only one of them, or you want something one way and they want something another way and they're mutually exclusive. You can't have both. But when you think about really like the interests behind those positions, you can better find resolutions and you can find ways where you can actually fit it together. I think of it kind of as like a puzzle pieces sometimes. And the idea of like, if you can figure out what all those different pieces are, you can put that puzzle together. There's a little bit of kind of, I don't know if you call it a parody or a story about two parties arguing over an orange. And both of them wanted the orange. And it isn't until they figured out like, why did they want the orange? So one of them wanted the juice and one of them wanted the peel, that they realized that even though there was only one orange, they still could both get what they wanted once they figured out what each of their interests are, because one of them could take the zest and then the other one could use the juice. And so now you've reached an agreement where if they had just both taken the positions of I want the orange and I want the orange and there's only one, they never reach a resolution.
That makes a whole lot of sense. And so mediation, two parties come together. It's not just the kids, but it's assets and everything else. And so is it legally binding?
Yeah. So mediation is voluntary to begin with. And, once you reach an agreement, especially if you're going to file that with the court. So for any of our divorce cases or parenting plans, anything that does have a court case associated with it, we file agreements with the court. So it's the same end result as if you went to court and you had a judge, order what your agreements are and, it got entered as your judgment, except for we come up with them together. We draft agreements for the clients. And then my business, all of us, we take care of doing the filings for them. And so once it's filed with the court, it's enforceable. It's a court order, just the same way as if you had gone through the court system.
But I couldn't advocate for mediation any more. It's, oh my gosh, to go into a lawsuit, two attorneys, you go into court, battling it out. I have seen way too many divorces where the only people who win are the attorneys. So if people can choose one attorney, let's get our orange figured out, get out of this thing quickly, amicably. Oh my gosh, it's so much better than litigating. And I love that. Let's also talk about prenups, because I think that's also anybody who's thinking about getting married. I really think everybody should have a prenup. That's just me. Talk about prenups and why they're important.
Yeah, definitely. And just kind of language wise, you might hear me. I refer to them a lot of times as premarital agreements. It sounds a little bit better. They're all the same, right? So prenup, prenuptial agreement, premarital agreement, all means the same thing and interchangeable. And I really like the way that you talk about it, because I think that so few people think about it that way, that everybody could use one. And I think that that's one of the things that, I do both representation work where I might represent one party in a prenup. And that's, one of the things that every state's different. So I'm in California, and in California, each party has to be represented by their own attorney. That's part of the enforceability. So every state's different. I can't speak for other states, but I think a lot of them have that. And so sometimes I will represent one party in, the drafting or negotiation or review of a premarital agreement. But other times I work as the mediator, and I do premarital mediation, kind of like I was just talking about we might do for divorce or parenting plan mediation. And as in that scenario, I work as a neutral third party still, and I work with both of them. And then they're going to go out and have it reviewed by their own individual attorneys. But what I like so much about that is that it kind of takes the stigma out of premarital agreements. I think sometimes there's that stigma of, are you only asking for one because you don't trust me? Or is it the family that's requiring it, right? I'm sure you've seen that where, parents might say, the way our estates are set up, the way stuff is set, we were requiring you to have a premarital agreement. And that never goes well, because that's being forced on by someone else.
I like to take the stigma out of this if we can. So help me with this, Amanda, because I look at like a situation where, let's say someone is coming in with a highly professional degree and they're going to make a lot of money, but they're coming into the wedding with, say, lots of debt. And let's say someone comes into that with a house and maybe they won't make as much, but let's break the stigma of premarital agreements, because I think if we can't talk about these things going into it, if we don't go into this with a knowledge of how things are going to work in our marriage, probably we shouldn't be going into the marriage if we don't have those communication skills. So,
yes. Yeah. So I think what I would say, first and foremost is what I think people don't always understand is if you don't have your own premarital agreement, if you don't sit down with your fiance and put one together, you do in a sense. You have whatever your state law is for your family laws, right? So in California, that means it's a community property state. And so that means it doesn't matter who earns what during the marriage. It all can be considered community property, and it could be split 50-50. And there's other things around, things like spousal support and just different things that are dealt with in terms of what's separate in community. And so people don't always think about that. But the idea is do you want to follow that? Right. I think that a lot of people, especially maybe those because I think it's more common in second and third marriages, but those that are maybe younger and getting married and may think, well, I don't have assets or debts right now to protect.
Right.
Or maybe like you're talking about, there is a scenario where there's a difference in what each person is bringing in and what it might look like during the marriage. But they're not thinking ahead of, well, do you want the state to dictate what things look like if you did separate or divorce down the road? And so I really like to have it, like you're saying, as a conversation. It's establishing good communication. It's talking about money and finances, which far too many people don't do before they get married. I'm sure you see. And it's, building that solid foundation. So honestly, you're probably less likely to get divorced because you've already started that conversation and had the communication around it. And it isn't about saying, well, if we get divorced, I don't want you to take anything. It's more about a conversation of, what do you want to have as joint assets or debts while you are married? And what do you maybe want to remain separate? And how do we set that up so that both parties feel comfortable and they're going into the marriage from a point of mutual agreement and, not fighting about it, which is why I think that mediation is so great for doing prenuptial agreements as well, because it's a happy time, right? You're getting married. Right. You shouldn't be this, like, you each hire an attorney and you're arguing about your prenup. It should be something that you're doing jointly and you're discussing and coming up with ways that you want your marriage to be.
Yeah. So I was just watching a thing over the weekend. It was a really interesting show on money, but it talked about the wife came from another culture and it was important for her to buy her mom a house and really help the family out financially. The husband was like, look, I don't want to work for somebody for the rest of my life. I want to build a business. And here were like two conflicting goals. And rather than fight about it, they decided they were just going to keep their money separate. And I thought that, that's a beautiful thing because none of us are 100% on the same page with our spouse when it comes to money. And so it's that premarital agreement that says, this is what I want out of life. This is what I want out of life. We're both going to get it. And this is how we're going to do it.
Yeah. And I think what's important in kind of a scenario like that is, without a legal document saying what may be separate, it doesn't matter if you keep it separate in a lot of states, it's still considered community. And so if you had made that, if that couple makes that decision jointly without documenting that and without making it clear that we know that this could be joint and doing that, well, let's say they live their life and their marriage and they set it up that way, but then they go to get divorced and one person isn't happy about something or they're arguing. Well, at that point, they may say, well, wait a second. We're in a community state or we're in an equitable distribution state. I should get some of whatever the other person had.
Right? Huge. Let's talk about second and third marriages because, oh my gosh, those don't come in 50-50 either. And so here we've got separate assets, disparate disparate wealth, kids that probably do or don't agree with this marriage. Like, how do you handle that?
Yeah. So that, I think there's all those pieces that you just mentioned going on. And I think that's where, I do think it's, like I said before, important for any marriage. But I think that especially when you are going into a second or a third marriage and you have, sometimes maybe you've been through a divorce before, or maybe your marriage ended other ways, but there's other things coming in and you may have kids that are young. And so it's, how are you going to support them, right? That may be different cost-wise things you wanted to do for college, things like that. Or you may have grown children. And when you have grown children, like you said, they're going to have their own opinions and, they may not agree with how things are being done. And so, it's having that conversation and again, making that plan and setting it up in a way that both parties feel comfortable. And they know, what things would look like. And not only just for divorce, but also for death. And so, I always, if I work with clients in a premarital agreement, I also want them to do their estate planning because I don't handle that side of it. But we do talk a little bit about, it's not just if you were to get divorced, but it's also thinking about, okay, if you were to die, what do you want your spouse to still have an interest in? And how do you want that to look? And that can be really important when you've got children from another marriage, because like you said, they might not always agree with that. And do you want to now set up your spouse to be arguing with your children from another relationship, and they may or may not get along. So I think that it's really important to, again, have those conversations and understand what that's going to look like. And also it's just the idea that for any premarital agreement, you're doing these financial disclosures. You're making sure that everybody knows like what is there. And I think that can be really important in those second and third marriages too, when you may be coming in with a lot more assets or debts from different situations, and understanding better how you want to hold those while you're married and what that's going to look like.
You just brought up something that's really kind of important, and I want you to expand on that, because I've seen in premarital agreements, if you don't admit to an asset, it's actually, did I hear it was community property? So you actually have to show everything going into it, right?
Yeah. So one of the requirements, at least again, California, but I believe most states have this, is that you have to do a full financial disclosure. And the reasoning behind that is that if you're entering into a premarital agreement, one of the things needs to be that it's voluntary, right? There's no undue influence, no fraud, no duress, there's nothing that you don't know, right? And so the full financial disclosure is so that each party knows what the other one has going into it, right? Because if you didn't know that your spouse had all of these accounts that were going to grow in value during the marriage, maybe you wouldn't have waived your right into all of those accounts, and maybe you would have discussed that differently. And so you have to disclose everything. If later you're going through a divorce and there were things that hadn't been disclosed, it's one of the reasons a prenup could be set aside. And so now you've done this, you maybe have operated under the assumption that you thought you had a valid prenup your whole marriage, and you don't. One of the other pieces, and this may be kind of what you're thinking more with divorce, is that if they haven't disclosed assets, it's harder to show what you had prior to marriage, right? It's harder to show that you had anything in that account, and that it could then all be considered community. And just like when you go through a divorce, you also have to disclose all of your financial information. It's making sure that all of that is clear. And beyond your assets and debts, it's also understanding your income and what the other person makes, because that's part of the conversation too. If you're going to waive maybe support in the future, you need to understand what you each make and what that might look like.
Well, and debts too. I mean, I would want to know if someone was coming into a relationship with a ton of debt. So all that stuff, stuff.
That's all required.
I was talking to someone, I said, and it was back in the day when prenups were like, oh, that's just distrust, and you're not going to get anything if you get divorced. And so I would ask people like, why a prenup? And I got one explanation that was absolutely beautiful. He said there was a couple that came in, and one of the spouses, the husband, had a lot of money, and the woman going into it really didn't. And they said, why would you want a prenup? And this woman said, if I'm going to give him the best years of my life, I want to make sure I'm protected. And so when we look at prenups, it's not just for that person who has all the money, but it's to protect the person who doesn't as well. And how smart was that woman to say, nope, lay it on the table now, buddy.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's where it's coming up with those agreements too that are going to work for them. And so you're not in a legal battle later, because in that sense, in the scenario like that, which, I think is what people think of a little more common in terms of entering into a prenup where, one of the spouses has a lot more assets and the other doesn't, is also that spouse wants to make sure it's upheld later. And if you're putting that other person in a position where if you got divorced, they got nothing, that could be seen as not being fair, right? And not being a scenario that is set up that way. And so I think if the parties can agree on what they want to be joint with, and also certain things that may remain separate, or if we're talking about support, I don't really like to advise people to do a full waiver of spousal support unless they're adamant about wanting to. But is there a way to maybe put some limits or put some things in place that protect both again, right? Making it known, okay, well, this person would get at least this amount of money. And, what does that look like, so that they know that even if you're starting out at a point where you make the same amount of money, you may make decisions during your marriage that changes that. And so it's having those conversations, and it really is to protect both. And again, I think, that's where mediation with a premarital agreement, I think, is so much better than just hiring their own attorneys, because the attorneys are only looking at it from the perspective of whoever their client is. And it becomes this back and forth fight. Whereas as the mediator, it's okay, let's focus on what you both want, and let's focus on what this is going to look like in the future.
And I think too about like the family home. If I'm going to be in a second marriage and we're going to live together in a house, well, if my spouse dies, I don't want to lose a spouse and a house at the same time. And probably my spouse's kids are going, hey, Sal, we want our money. And I think that's, again, a huge area to say, no, you're not going to get kicked out of your house. You will get to live in it. But then, how do the expenses get paid between, say, the first and the second death? What if all those things are huge.
Yeah. And also, then one of the things I've worked out a lot is like, how long do they have to stay in that property, right? Like you said, you don't want to lose your spouse and also feel like you have to be out of your house right away, right? So is there a time period that either maybe you're selling and then, if that spouse is getting a portion of it that the kids are, or if they're going to buy out the kids, that they have the time to do that. And then also making sure that they have the financial means to do that, right? So we've talked about, what could be put in place so that if you did need to buy out the children, you could if you wanted to, but at least having time, not feeling like that's something that they have to do right away.
Right. I think too, that prenup is probably going to avoid a lot of fights with your spouse's children's too, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's hopefully avoiding a lot of fights all around, right?
Right.
And being able to, even if you do divorce down the road, it's having that stuff in place, and it's knowing that you don't have to fight about it then, but you've discussed it when you are most likely happier and like your spouse, as opposed to when you're getting divorced and, at least one, if not both people are upset or emotional about something. And it's just allowing that, to happen. And I have to say, it's not going to be, and I'm always very upfront with clients that it's not, I can't 100% say that your prenup is always going to be upheld, right? If there's a reason, but it's doing what's necessary for your state. So it's making sure you work with, an attorney who understands what the guidelines are in whatever state you are to make sure that they are going to be valid. And it's following all of that. And it's also making sure that if you're setting the prenup up in a way where both people are taken care of, it's less likely that either of them are going to argue it, as opposed to if it is where one person's going to get nothing. Well, of course, they're going to try to argue that the prenup isn't valid because they feel that they're not getting anything out of it if they walk away.
So Amanda, give our listeners some advice here. If I was approaching a marriage and I wanted to do a prenuptial agreement, what is a graceful way to approach that subject?
Yeah. So I think that everyone's going to be a little different, but it's knowing what's important to your future spouse, right? And it's understanding, why to have that discussion. And, I think that it is, again, it's not about the not trusting, or it's not about, it's more about bringing it to them as an idea of planning for your future, right? And having those conversations and communicating around what it is. And I think that, more often than not, we don't have those conversations because they're uncomfortable, right? And they're difficult conversations. And, I think that we avoid them. And, if you're getting married, it's the last thing you want to focus on, right? I understand that I'm not the person that people want to be working with leading up to their wedding. And I've been in the position. My husband and I have our own premarital agreement that we put together before we got married last year. I do know what it's like to be on both sides and, have those conversations. And even though, I do what I do, so we talk about it a lot more, and my husband's a financial planner. So clearly, we do talk about money where we were, from the very beginning when we started dating. But even then, there were some uncomfortable conversations to try to think about okay, well, what happens if we do divorce? What does that look like? And, I understand that it can how helpful it can be to have a third party to help with those conversations. And that's one of the things I think is if you can, broach the topic with your spouse, but then work with a professional who's going to be, as a mediator and more collaborative and work with everyone together, then you're bringing them into a joint conversation. You're not just saying, okay, well, I hired an attorney, they drafted this prenup, and now you need to hire an attorney. But instead, you're doing all those conversations together.
Yeah. This has been an excellent conversation. I wish we could break down the stigmas of prenups, and I think you have just done an excellent job doing that. I wish more people would get them. So, Amanda, if someone was going into a marriage, what would you say? What advice would you give them?
Yeah, I think that it's thinking about a premarital agreement, right? And I'm not going to say that everybody's going to end up getting one, or maybe you don't need one. Maybe you do want to follow the state laws, but just having those conversations. And sometimes I even meet with couples who want to do some like premarital mediation, and it's not going to always end in a prenup, right? So it's just the idea of broaching that conversation, having those conversations. And I think it used to be a more so, people would go to maybe a religious advisor for like premarital counseling, but thinking about this in the same way, that it's important to think about the finances and what things are going to look like as you get married. And the sooner you can do it, or the earlier before the wedding, the better. There are some time constraints in different states. California has one of those. And so we need the time before the wedding to make sure that actually happens. So it can be helpful to broach it, I'd say, as early as possible, so it doesn't become this like down to the wire or a feeling of being pressured into it if the one spouse doesn't have the time to think about it.
Got it. I love that. Now, let me ask you another question. If someone's thinking about divorcing, what advice would you give someone? Because again, it's highly emotional. We're about to lose half of everything.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to someone thinking about a divorce?
So somebody who's thinking about a divorce, I think two big pieces I would give. One is just to explore all your options, right? And that's where it's learning about how can you go through that divorce process? Because I think that sometimes, mediation isn't going to work for every situation. I am realistic about that. There's going to be some it doesn't. But for the most part, I think more people could, and they just may not have known about it or had the information. So it's doing research and, finding out what are your options for how you go through it. And sometimes it's also, I think another professional that's really helpful, if you've heard of, is like divorce coaches, being able to have somebody who can kind of work through some of that emotional side with you and, help you understand, do you want to move forward with it? Are there other things you want to try first? Therapy, counseling, whatever that might look like, that it gives you the ability to kind of have somebody help you with that. Because it can be really difficult to decide, what path you want to go down at that point. So those are two of the big things I'd say to think about at the beginning.
Well, and I think that too, it makes a lot of sense if people know that, hey, let's at least mediate the things that we can agree on. So we can do a hybrid. It doesn't have to be all or none, but let's mediate what we can and save that money and save that argument. And the things we can't decide on, then you can go to court with just those. So I think it shortens the process. It makes the process a little bit easier and a whole lot less expensive.
It definitely does, because also, what it is even if for some reason you started in mediation and you didn't end up finishing, it's not going to be a waste of what you did during that time. You'll have done your financial disclosures. You'll have done things that your attorneys are going to charge you for anyways. And you will most likely get some, and get some agreements out of it. So even if you don't get 100% done in mediation, you've tried and you've at least lowered the cost and the time and everything.
Beautiful. Amanda, what makes you happy at the end of the day?
There's I would say, work-wise, it makes me happy to see clients talking and communicating and actually working together. And outside of work, my husband and my dog, I've got a wonderful dog who comes to the office with us. So if you look at our website, you'll see him on there as well. But I think it's just being able to spend time with them.
Oh, I love that. And how can our listeners find you?
Yes, you can find us online. So it's westcoastfamilymediation.com. And all of our contact information is on there, as well as we post a lot of blogs and videos and articles. We really want people just to be able to have information. So even if they're not going to go through mediation, or you're in a state outside of California, there's a lot of information there to read.
Very good. Well, thank you so much for your time. I have learned a lot from you, and you've actually even helped me change my thinking on prenups more and how to approach them. And so this has been fabulous. Thank you so much.
Advisory services are offered through Barbara J. Norman, LLC, an investment advisor in the states of California and Texas. The information contained herein should in no way be construed or interpreted as a solicitation to sell, nor an offer to sell advisory services to any residents of any state other than the state of California, or where otherwise legally permitted. All content is for information purposes only. It is not intended to provide any tax or legal advice or provide the basis for any financial decisions. The information contained in this material has been derived from sources believed to be reliable, but is not guaranteed as to accuracy and completeness and does not purport to be complete analysis of the materials discussed. The opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect those of SagePath Solutions and are subject to change without notice.